For those of you who just heard the last talk, which was great, and is from somebody who's just down the street from Alexis and where Alexis and I work. One of the things that is different about what we're saying compared to what was just presented is we're talking about social science students who oftentimes are looking for careers in things related to social justice. And whereas climate science, right, no one, even somebody who's not interested in climate science, no one is going to deny the utility of quantitative information. The fact of the matter is, lots of social science students really kind of dread statistics. This is not news to any of you. So since we got started so late, let me just blow through this. One of the problems we face in undergraduate social science quantitative classes is that there's usually a single class that we have to train students in quantitative methods. Now, not only is that inadequate, but it also isolates the class compared to the rest of the curriculum. Maybe sometimes there's a research design class that kind of leans toward quantitative stuff, but usually there are not substantive focused, right, things about drugs in America, racial segregation, population, et cetera, that are quantitatively focused. And that's part of what we're engaged in at San Francisco State. We want to, and have been, creating some curricular reforms that we think are useful for other sociology departments and possibly other disciplines such as anthropology and political science. So right now at San Francisco State, you know, we have sort of the traditional model of social science education and stats. And what we do is we teach about half of our majors a quantitative class at the very end of their career. There's an analogous qualitative methods class that's also taught and is an alternative. We do surprisingly well kind of attracting students to the quantitative class given that they have an option. And overall, our goals are to kind of create a quantitative literacy. And this is, you know, the kind of aspiration we have, right? And then we want to give them skills to analyze data and to show how it might work for their imagined social careers in some social service or social justice setting.
Okay, and what we want to do is just share some of the key assignments that we use in this course. And I was going to send my assignment in the chat, and I'll do that a bit later, but while I'm sharing my screen, I can't. So let me just highlight a few. So what Chris and I do, and we've taught and talked about this course for the past decade or 12 years together. And we do a similar final assignment, which is to ask our students to move from descriptive statistics to inferential statistics and to generate original findings on a chosen topic of importance that's hopefully meaningful and they're interested in, using publicly available data. And then through that process throughout the semester, they visualize the data through figures, they generate tables, they run descriptive statistics, they learn how to describe the descriptive statistics, and then ideally, they generate some bivariate findings and do some, logic of inference around statistical significance. And what we're trying to do overall is build both their written and oral communication skills by describing, visualizing, interpreting, and hopefully critiquing. They do this individually through this final paper. They present it to the class, and then they also work on groups on sort of smaller assignments that have some of these crucial elements as well. And I can send toward the end the actual prompt for the main assignment that I use.
If you can all just use your applause button to vote on the following, what do you think are the best ways to engage social science students, right? who are interested in social service careers to be interested in quantitative analysis? Should they read and discuss published reports and articles addressing social justice questions? Ooh, we got a couple on that. Oh, I do see a couple of applauses though. Oh, sorry, those are hands. Raise your hand, not applause. Any hand gesture will do. How about for focus on social justice issues, such as racial segregation? There we go. Teach students to publicly analyze, publicly available data and to produce stuff. That looks like the most popular. Teach students to analyze publicly available data and make inferences about a population based on a sample. Okay. All right. So obviously those four things are, a gestalt. We want to kind of accomplish all of that. And what we found to be key is the middle two, right? That if we focus our quantitative classes and not call them kind of the stats requirement in sociology, but rather focus them as a class on something like racial segregation or opioid addiction, the attentiveness of the students to the material is greater, and what they end up grappling with is at a deeper level than what we've experienced in the past. To do that, we need to provide them pretty good data sets, and luckily there's a ton of really strong social science data sets out there.
Okay, so as we said at the beginning of our presentation, overall our main goal is to build quantitative literacy. And we find, as Chris said, our students come into our class with great trepidation. And we found that if we triangulate these substantive topics in the class, it engages the students way more. I did this probably about halfway through starting to teach. When I started to teach this class, I started to use journalism, like the Upshot is particularly good from the New York Times. We both use Pew Research Center, Kaiser Healthcare Foundation. Our Health Foundation is not on here, but that's another one that has a great body or a wealth of sort of summary reports that are packed with data. And then also academic articles where students can get a sense of the research that's been done. They find it incredibly powerful when they can read the academic articles and read the statistics sections, and it becomes more user-friendly, and they realize that they can have something to say about the topic they're studying. And we gave the examples of racial segregation and opioid overdoses, but we've had students, excuse me, look at criminal justice system using the FBI, uniform reporting data, immigration using general social survey, mental health using the youth risk behavior survey. So there's a lot of ways in which the students can kind of gather information and start to really be comfortable with numbers in a way they hadn't been before at the beginning of the semester. And we wanted to highlight this Upshot. So this is if everyone wants to click on this link, so this is one of the ways we engage the students and help build their quantitative literacy. So if you, and I guess I'm screen sharing, I'm hesitant to mess with it. I will not.
I put it in the chat box.
Okay, great, thank you. So if you want to, everyone wants to just take a minute or two, and Chris, if you want to chime in here as well, since I can't quite see, because I'm just looking at my screen that's sharing. So there's a lot of these interactive dashboards out there. I have one later as well, but this one my students particularly loved. You put in your own university, and then you can start breaking down the percentiles in terms of the demographics of who is going to their own university, as well as comparing that to others either in the state or overall in the country. And Chris, do you want to add anything?
And if you go farther in this, it comes from that New York Times group that does all the information graphics and such. So there's links to that. And if you go down that rabbit hole, which many of our students do, you know, they end up finding things from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of the Census, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't work for all of them, but, you know, there's a small set of people who kind of get obsessed with this.
Yeah. And I also found they're typically surprised by what they learn about their school and how it compares to other schools. You know, it's powerful, especially as they are, you know, finishing a 2.5-year sequence of courses that are heavy in theory and writing and talking about sociological concepts, like stratification, and then just to visualize the data this way is a really helpful tool to keep them engaged in the material, which we find to be a challenge. All right, should we keep going?
We're at 9:04.
Okay. Next is your Chris.
Yeah, so when we present students with something like Alexis just showed you, that data is most often publicly available. So, you know, like a lot of us, we have that made available to them, and then you know, end up having them analyze this data, which is great. The downside of this, of course, is the amount of time it takes to teach software for the students to use. This is where the isolation of the stats class, again, becomes a problem, right? This is the only time they're touching SPSS or SAS or R or Stata. And, you know, it's a lot to ask students to learn in just and for just a single class. But we had a poll that we're going to ask you all to chime in on how much class time you chew up teaching something like this. But in the interest of time, we should probably just skip that.
We can ask at the end when there's time for questions. We're interested in what kind of software others use and your experiences with it.
Right.
What percentage of the time? All right, Chris.
So what we find works well, right? Like we were saying before, is making the class more like the rest of the curriculum. Our classes that are more thematic do much better. The parenthetical here, but the rest of the curriculum also has to become more like us, has to do with that last slide about teaching software that might be used in a number of different classes, and teaching about, you know, social measures that people maybe hear about throughout the curriculum, but never get introduced to until this final class. So, for example, we talk a lot about poverty in our department, but we generally don't actually explain how to calculate a poverty rate, or what the federal poverty line is, or what these measures of 125% of poverty or 150% of poverty actually mean until we get to our class. And it's, you know, obviously piled on top of a lot of other stuff at that point, and we don't know how well it sinks in. We generally emphasize, you know, descriptive stats and simple bivariate statistics related to a single subject. And yes, that is limiting in terms of how deeply they can, you know, learn different statistical tools, but it keeps their connection to the data pretty firm. We've had a very difficult time, both of us, figuring out how to drag students far enough along to get sort of an inferential imagination developed in them while still doing these other things.
Yeah.
And the areas of improvement.
Yeah, you segued well into that. Like Chris said, also one of the biggest challenges we encounter are what we call individual mindsets. So our students, likely choose I would say maybe 10% of our students choose the class because they're interested in quantitative analysis. Others are required to take it because it's what's available and it's what fits their schedule. And they come in with a high prevalence of quantitative anxiety. They have negative math mindsets. They tell themselves they aren't good at math. I hear it throughout the entire semester. And because this course is required for graduation, it feels like a high pressure, high stakes course that we are trying to make lower stakes and accessible. So they come out of it feeling like they have power to understand the data. Some of the challenges we encounter with getting to that place is, like Chris said, they haven't had a math course during their undergraduate education. Some of them, they might take something in high school and they take a test and that allows them to opt out of any further classes until they reach us. Some do take a stats class at their, community college. I've had a wide range of experiences. Another big key one for us is that students don't engage with our assigned stats textbooks. We use different books. I often use Society Statistics for a Diverse Society, but they report frustration and they don't read it. We've found that students show up engaged, ready to learn and excited. It's very interactive. We're in a computer lab, but once they leave, we can't maintain and continue the engagement with the material. So we're working on that. Chris already spoke about the major curriculum and reducing the isolation. The other thing we just struggle with, like we've already alluded to, is that we could spend the entire 14-week semester covering quantitative, descriptive statistics, and just building quantitative literacy and comfort level with numbers. Once we hit central limit theorem, sampling distributions, degrees of freedom, statistical significance, while we feel they're important, we struggle to present them in an applied context that has meaning for how they, for doing the bivariates and understanding, error, et cetera. But there often is just, it's when the class we can really struggle with keeping everyone involved and engaged. Which leads us to some future directions. And we're thinking always about reconceptualizing our assigned text and reading materials. I've really tried to expand into finding animated videos, podcasts. I said the interactive data dashboard before. I included that. Another one that my students find of interest is the California opioid overdose surveillance dashboard. You can play around with that later, but anything like this that, presents maps, interactive tables, allows them to make, the data personal to where they live or where they go to school. The bunnies, dragons, and the normal world on the central limit theorem, they love. There's not enough videos like these. I always encourage them to, if someone could go out and make them. We're also looking for other suggestions of videos you might, or ways to engage this material to our undergraduate students, social science students. And then Chris, you want to take it up now?
Sure. So our plan at State, right, is to not just work on our classes. So Alexis and I's master plan here involves the entire curriculum. So part of the curricular revisions has to do with making a social inequalities class that is already going to be kind of a required first class in the major, do a little more quantitative stuff, including using kind of basic measures of inequality. So anyone who teaches that class introduces students to the poverty line and how it's calculated, to Gini coefficients, and how to make sense of them, and has published material that students read in that class that allows them to look at maps, charts, tables, right, that have them grapple with these statistics. There are a couple intermediate classes that are based on subject matter like sociology of health, drugs in society, population and society, that'll have much more quantitative content and hopefully will well coordinate in terms of like the software used and such, so students have this continuity of experience. And then by the time you get to the capstone course, quantitative methods, we'll be able to assume they know a lot more than what they currently know.
Yeah.
Given the time, should we turn to a couple of questions?
So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and one is something you can probably answer for us offline, about having more resources for this publicly available data. And some of the links and are in your slides, which I imagine you'll make available to us so that we can post them online and you can find that. The other is, what are your thoughts on using social justice issues in a general education stats course?
Chris, given your book and how you've taught other classes, you should answer.
And well, in California, the Department of Education makes data on all public schools available through something called DataQuest. And most departments of education in states do this. And so that information is great. And like most states, California, synthesizes a bunch of performance information into a single indexical score, what used to be called the API score in California. And so, when I've taught this class with an education theme, that's the data that I've sucked down. And you get to see the school performance index, and much like, Alexis's link that she shared earlier, students get to look up their own high school or elementary school or middle school and find out, how well it did. You move from that to looking at the demographic characteristics of the students in the school, and you see this association between race and school performance index, and that raises a lot of questions about, like, how is the API score formulated? What does it mean? How should it be interpreted? Right? And that's kind of the entree point. We're doing something similar to that, just with different subject matter. My experience with students in education courses is that they have the same social justice orientation that social science students do, and that they have the same anxieties about math that social science students do.
And just to add, did you mean also that talking about or asking about incorporating social justice into GE classes, or just general?
Yeah, I think that was the question about a course that, has all sorts of majors in it. And the education data is a place to start, certainly.
Yeah, I think it's very engaging. I think the students, it deepens their knowledge and finds them something to be interested in and that they can build on as they progress in education. If they, if they're being taught about, overdoses, opioid overdoses, or, immigration stats or racial segregation when they're freshmen, they're more likely by the time they're a senior to have developed what they feel is an expertise that they can carry forward, and it can impact their career path.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're probably out of time. We're over already, but that's okay. We've